Welcome to the realm of science fiction, where imagination knows no bounds and extraordinary stories unfold. Enjoy the adventure. The planet below breathed in stillness, untouched by culture or conquest. Its surface shimmered with a veil of organic haze, microbial clouds pulsing in rhythms no one yet understood. Every orbit of the outpost tightened the silence between the stars and the questions that waited beneath them. Above that living enigma floated a station not born of one mind, but two. Human alloy met Velari chitin in seamless contradiction. Steel rivets married to lattice-grown bone. The walls sighed with atmospheric recalibrations, not from malfunction but from negotiation. Every vent, every corridor was a compromise etched. In engineering, within its modular heart, diplomacy sat on a blade's edge. The humans and Velari shared nothing but proximity. Jargon and translation tech formed a fragile bridge, and still, the simplest touch could mean invitation or insult. Their science was shared, but their souls remained locked behind instinct and protocol. Corin Vance, ever the skeptic, monitored biosurface telemetry, his eyes drawn more often to behavior than biology. And Thy'shira Vael, precise to the molecule, calculated ambient pheromone drift with religious detachment. Two minds orbiting each other, cautious, clinical, and wholly unaware that one anomaly, one sample, would burn through the silence like a solar flare, and the station would never be quiet again. Corin moved through the analytic arrays like a man pacing old battlefields, precise, silent, and always braced for a breach that wouldn't come. The screens displayed microbial flowcharts and pheromone feedback loops, but behind his practiced gaze flickered the ghosts of Eden 5. Not the mission failure. Those happened. It was the silence after. The reports sealed, the crew fragments buried in orbit, and the line in his record that said reassigned instead of exiled. Redemption wasn't a goal, it was a chain. He wore it in the way he avoided eye contact during cross-species briefings, in how he overcorrected data inputs to mask intuition. Trust had become a luxury, more dangerous than decompression. Yet here, among alien pheromone scripts and logic-laced colleagues, something stirred. Not forgiveness, not even peace, but a friction. A gravity between past and present that couldn't be ignored, and far below the planet turned, untouched, wild, and waiting to be understood. Thy'shira moved with the elegance of engineered. Intent, each step measured, each breath filtered through chromatic glands tuned to neutrality. Her scent was blank by design, not absence but suppression, a fortress against uncontrolled resonance. The Velari valued precision above instinct, logic over legacy. And she was their exemplar, her thoughts processed faster than her words, passing body language in microsecond intervals, searching for irregularities, deviations, threat vectors wrapped in human warmth. She didn't fear the humans, she pitied their chaos. Pity, she reminded herself, was a chemical byproduct of empathy, and empathy was wasteful. Yet behind her ocular membrane, faint tremors flared. Curiosity, perhaps, or a response to the humidity in the human sectors. The ambassador of restraint did not react, but part of her, buried deep in ancestral code, remembered a time before restraint, and in the presence of sweat and scars and strange warmth, some forgotten part of her stirred. The garment was ordinary, coarse, military cotton, soaked in salt water and lactic acid, laced with stress markers and metabolic residue. To Thy'shira, it should have been data, harmless, predictable, a biochemical report waiting to be compiled. Velari had studied human excretions before, sweat, tears, even blood. None had ever breached their filters. But this time, the filters faltered. She catalogued the molecules, urea, sodium, pheromonal derivatives, standard readings, yet her limbs felt weighted. Her spine arched slightly. Her mandibles twitched in a way she hadn't experienced since juvenility. It wasn't the compounds, it was their arrangement, the pattern. A primitive code beneath the surface, whispering resonance into Velari neurochemistry. The scent was a memory she had never lived. Somewhere, deep in the evolutionary lattice of her species, a response loop awakened. Pulse rate elevated. Glandular, secretions rose. A subharmonic buzz hummed beneath her skin, a mating signal. But it wasn't meant to be triggered, not by a fabric, not by a human, not by accident. Her thoughts grew staggered. Her logical matrix passed the event, labeled it anomaly. Then hazard, then classified. She sealed the garment in containment, but her own containment had already failed, and the first crack in the Velari facade had begun to split. She had analyzed countless biological specimens before. Fluids, tissues, scents, each reduced to numbers, sequences, and sterilized conclusions. She was Velari, evolved beyond chaos, programmed for balance, a vessel of restraint. But this scent was an ambush. The fibers still held his heat, soaked with signals. Her filters couldn't decode fast enough. Her fingers trembled. She drew in a breath, methodical and clinical, preparing to dismiss the results as contamination. Then the storm hit. Sensor arrays in her sinuses lit up like emergency strobes. Her pupils dilated. Heart rate spiked. Neural threads flooded with electrical storms her species hadn't recorded since the pre-civilized age. Data overflowed. Control collapsed. Instincts clawed their way up from the bedrock of her genome. Old instincts. Ones no longer spoken of. Ones buried in the fossil memory of her kind. Chemical pulses screamed of recognition, of proximity, of bond. Her knees threatened collapse. Her mind raced to smother the flood, to smother herself. She hadn't just inhaled a scent. She had triggered a rite. It wasn't supposed to matter, but it did. And now it was inside her, waking something that evolution had ordered her to forget. The protocol initiates, sterile, silent, precise, a sequence of neural inhibitors deploy through her spine. Glandular dampeners trigger in waves. Internal algorithms scan her systems, looking for foreign agents, for viral sabotage, for any explanation that fits the comfort of logic. But none arrives. Her body doesn't feel invaded. It feels awake, not broken, alerted. Like a melody it once knew, playing again on forgotten instruments. Every pulse, every breath now thrums in sync with a rhythm too primal for code, too ancient for Velari control. She clings to discipline, to silence, to protocols crafted to keep biology tame. Yet beneath those protocols something moves. It does not ask, it remembers, and it wants. The numbers lie first. Molecular readings dip below threshold by mere microns, enough to pass inspection, but not enough to fool her own body. The dampeners sputter, not fail, but falter, like a firewall thinning at the edges. Her breath holds steady. Her thoughts do not resonance builds in her core, not noise, not pain, vibration, ancient and low, as though her bones remember something her mind was taught to forget. He passes by. Corin, not near, just closer than baseline, and it spikes again. The tail coils, minutely, involuntarily. Her subharmonic larynx emits a tremor she's never practiced. She postures with unconscious grace, limbs angled not for defense but display. These gestures are pre-programmed into her genome, rituals buried beneath layers of scientific suppression. She notices them only after they pass, and when she corrects them, her chest aches, as if some signal remains unfulfilled. What alarms? Her most isn't the physical response, it's the mind behind it, the desire for the pattern to complete, to lean closer, to verify the source, to inhale it again. She logs herself into the medbay privately. No alert, no external markers. She initiates recalibration. The results confirm the truth. No infection, no external compound, no neural drift. It is him, or perhaps it is her, not corrupted. Not malfunctioning, just tuned. And now unable to unhear the melody. Control, she was told, is evolution's triumph. But in this moment, craving feels far older, far stronger, and it has just begun to wake. Corin had seen many things, some classified, most scarring, but few as unnerving as the way she looked at him now. Not with disdain, not even curiosity. It was something else. The tilt of her head held no scientific inquiry, just stillness, measured and deliberate. Her tail undulated behind her in slow sine wave motions, too rhythmic to be idle twitching, and that hum, barely audible, rattled faintly in his bones, not his ears. He catalogued the signs instinctively, behavioral anomalies, potential mimicry. Disrespect, maybe. Was she mocking him? Was this some Velari way of asserting dominance, subtle power plays behind protocol masks? He'd seen it before, on Eden 5. A smile interpreted as friendship, followed by the deaths of 7. He wasn't about to be misled by another alien version of a smirk. She moved a step closer, and he instinctively shifted back, hand twitching toward the non-existent sidearm no longer issued on peaceful outposts. His heart pounded, not from fear, but readiness. If this was the prelude to betrayal, he would not be caught off guard. He didn't know that to her, the tail's motion was reverence, the hum, an instinctive signal of interest. All she saw in return was recoil. To her, the human flinched from what he did not understand. To him, the alien played a game he refused to lose. Her blood chemistry didn't lie. Synapse by synapse, her neural lattice lit up like a starfield on fire. Biofeedback loops surged beyond Velari norms, cascading through pituitary gates thought immune to cross-species triggers. The med scanners pulsed red with readings too bizarre to categorize. Spikes in corticosensory bonding hormones. Ancient glandular residues once tied to Velari mate recognition protocols. Nothing matched. Everything alarmed. The first to speak called it contamination. The second, sabotage. By the fifth voice, the room pulsed with implication. What had begun as silent concern turned viral. Words like biochemical infiltration and tactical seduction vectors swirled through diplomatic channels. Someone even dared whisper war pretext. Official channels demanded answers. Internal sensors were pulled from the station's archive. Every frame of Thy'shira's lab activity was dissected for anomalies. But data wasn't enough. Theories bred in silence faster than truth ever could. Her body, her dignity, became evidence. Unwilling, unknowing, unreadable. The council didn't say it outright, but the undertone was clear. Humans had done something. Maybe not deliberately, maybe not with weapons, but through pheromones, behavior, presence. The fear wasn't infection, it was influence. And at the center of it all, one quiet, trembling fact burned brighter than any accusation. She didn't want to stop feeling what she felt. They didn't call it exile, but it felt like it. A sterile medical hold, lined with ionic barriers, replaced her role as a respected diplomat scientist with the status of an unstable variable. Her scent filters were doubled, neural dampeners applied without consent. They locked her body down, not for her safety but for the optics. No hearing, no defense, just containment. Her clearance was revoked, research logs scrubbed, every past interaction dissected by sterile eyes hungry for blame. Dignitaries whispered of her uncontainable biological temperament, a phrase sterilized for public reports but loaded with shame beneath its syllables. The shame wasn't just hers. It was Velari-wide, a violation of their claim to evolved emotional neutrality. Corin, too, found no refuge. His workstation was sealed off. Every data packet transmitted from his console was flagged and analyzed. Security officers reviewed footage frame by frame, looking not for truth but for leverage. The inquiry wasn't about understanding, it was about containment, control, denial. The question wasn't what happened, it was who destabilized the species line. And yet through the cold walls and isolation, the unspoken truth burned in both of them. Whatever had been triggered, it wasn't a mistake. It was a message neither side wanted to read. They called it contamination, not a virus, not a weapon, just a scent, a breath, a spike of hormones in a being not meant to feel so deeply. Yet for the Velari extremists, it was enough. The old guard surged with fury across comm channels, robes, sigils, and titles flashing as they labeled Earth a corruptive anomaly. Their words were polished and cold, weaponized through protocol. Genetic destabilization, cultural corrosion, mimetic threat. But beneath the sterile phrasing, the fear was raw. Corin watched from behind glass and static, each phrase another tectonic shift beneath his boots. He had known war, but this was worse. A slow diplomatic implosion masquerading as orderly counsel, debate. They dissected every data file from the incident like it was an invasion. One breath, they said, one human's biology, and centuries of controlled evolution were unraveling. No defense, no appeal. He wasn't just a biologist anymore. He was a symptom, and Thy'shira. They didn't speak her name, not directly. Not after they labeled her a carrier of behavioral regression. Her face flickered in protest footage, blurred, anonymized, yet always unmistakable. One human's body, one alien's instincts, and now a treaty held by threads. Threads soaked in fear and memory. And something older still, They called it collaboration. In truth, it was exile disguised as duty. 2 names, 2 bodies, 1 lab, stripped of its usual chatter and gloss. Only silence now, thick with mistrust, sharpened by something neither could define nor deny. Thy'shira calculated every step with surgical discipline. Her tail coiled tightly, her posture perfect, pheromone dampeners dialed to their limits. Yet none of it quelled the storm inside. The proximity, the shared air, the scent of him, still laced with faint traces of dried salt and organic musk, curled. Like static along her neural lattice, instinct stirred, logic strained. Across from her, Corin worked with a mechanical stillness that belied the chaos beneath. He didn't understand her, never had. The Velari way was elegance over explanation, mystery over transparency. And after Eden 5, after everything, mystery had become synonymous with threat. Their dialogue was minimal, each word weighed before release. She accused by omission, he defended through data. But the unsaid was louder. The longer they stayed together, the more the atmosphere thickened. Micro-movements became observable patterns, pulse sync, heat exchange, an algorithm of attraction they had no protocol for. They were not partners, they were controlled variables, but the experiment was failing. Every glance lingered longer. Every accidental brush of hands came with a surge of bioelectric response, neither admitted to sensing. What had begun as containment was spiraling into convergence. They were here to extinguish a fire, but the fire had found kindling, and it was learning how to breathe. Thy'shira once believed the mind could master anything: emotion, pain, instinct. She'd been trained to silence all 3 with algorithms of thought and meditative pulses, designed to override primal drives. But belief is easy at a distance, when the body isn't unraveling. Now her logic, once sharp as plasma wire, buckled beneath waves of chemical storms. Internal sensors logged each anomaly with clinical precision: erratic pheromone discharge, elevated pulse frequencies, micro-contractions along bonding glands long deemed vestigial. Her tail flared in subconscious displays, twitching toward Corin's. Last location like a compass that refused recalibration. Pupils widened in low light. Vocal resonance lowered unconsciously. She annotated each event like a scientist observing a failing prototype. Except the subject was her and worse. She wanted the failure to continue. Every thought of Corin now carried heat, not desire. No, she told herself, but heat. Memory triggers wrapped in scent, posture, presence. He did nothing overt. He wasn't trying. That made it worse. He was kind without calculation, guarded yet sincere. And her body remembered something older than Velari society, older than language. Bond, anchor, merge. She resisted. She repeated internal mantras, recited molecular equations, meditated on the concept of individuality like it was a shield. But her limbs betrayed her, leaning slightly in his direction during lab sessions. Her eyes lingered, her breath synced. This wasn't malfunction. This was memory coded into protein and blood, a resonance forgotten by her species, now awakened by proximity. And still, she clung to her will. She would not become biology's puppet. Not for him, not for her people. She was more than flesh, but every moment made that harder to believe. She wasn't losing her mind, she was remembering what it once meant to have one shared. Compassion to a Velari had always been a concept, abstract, studied, catalogued. But to Corin it was muscle memory. When he saw her tremble under the weight of silent restraint, it wasn't science that moved him. It was something older, buried deep in human marrow. The instinct to reach out, to hold steady what threatened to break. He knew the consequences. Every protocol on the outpost made it clear. Physical contact with Velari during biochemical deviation was prohibited. Cultural contamination, diplomatic risk, career suicide. Yet none of those terms explained the way she seemed to be drowning in her own skin, bracing herself as if her body were a war zone she no longer commanded. So he touched her. Not out of desire, not out of curiosity, but humanity. The kind Velari didn't understand until now. Her reaction was seismic, not externally but within. Her core trembled, not from panic but recognition. Neural pulses lit up across dormant pathways. The warmth of his hand ignited a calm she had never been taught to expect from another. It was not dominance, it was not conquest, it was presence. To her, that simple kindness felt like an invasion of the soul. To him, it felt like betrayal of duty, of distance, of the boundaries he'd set between his past failures and this strange fragile now. The tether formed in silence, and with it, the beginnings of a fracture, one that would grow not between species, but within their hearts. Love not yet, but gravity had shifted, and neither would orbit alone again. Command responded with silence, not denial, not condemnation, just the cold absence of guidance, an institutional shrug veiled in protocol. Corin wasn't reprimanded, nor was he reassured. The channels he once trusted became walls, no messages, no clarity, just isolation, sharpened by whispers and half-glances that grew louder in meaning the quieter the station became. The other humans noticed. They weren't told what happened, only that something had. Something too delicate, too alien, too classified to be acknowledged out loud. In the absence of facts, the void filled itself with fear. Fear turned to fiction. Fiction bred suspicion. They saw the changes in Thy'shira but didn't understand the cause. They saw Corin retreating into himself, eyes scanning rooms like they might attack him. Some thought he'd compromised security. Others believed the Velari had gotten into his head, into his blood. One rumor suggested he'd initiated first contact with intent. Another claimed he was being studied like a parasite. Even casual greetings became calculated. Jokes died before reaching him. Lab partners shifted rosters. Privacy became exile. And in that silence, the station echoed with something more dangerous than accusation. Doubt. Corin wasn't just alone. He was being erased, breath by breath, from the narrative they were too afraid to write. The leak was surgical, precision-timed, framed in shadow, wrapped in rhetoric. An encrypted data packet wormed its way into public Velari networks, then exploded across their infospheres like a pathogen. Grainy footage of Thy'shira, sweating, trembling, eyes dilated, flashed on screens with pulsing overlays that screamed weaponization. Her biometric readouts, once classified, now danced beneath inflammatory headlines. Velari extremists pounced. The footage, they claimed, proved everything they'd warned against. Human proximity wasn't collaboration, it was contamination. They didn't see a biological reaction. They saw psychological invasion, pheromonal infiltration, chemical domination. The human scent wasn't benign. It was engineered, sent as a scalpel, romance as warfare, state forums filled with accusations. Editorials invoked ancient biowars, times when scent-borne viruses collapsed civilizations. Now, they warned, Earth had rediscovered that horror and repurposed it, cloaked in diplomacy, executed through proximity, and disguised as accident. Council chambers ignited with fury. Science gave way to fear. Biological compatibility was no longer an achievement. It was rebranded as assault. Evidence was warped, context erased, dialogue became threat. Some demanded Earth's immediate sanctions. Others called for the expulsion of all human personnel, citing interspecies mind control as grounds for biological warfare charges. Internal diplomatic channels choked with paranoia. Treaties trembled. Trust cracked. Amid the noise, Thy'shira became more than a researcher. She became a cautionary tale. And Corin, the alleged catalyst, was no longer just a man. He was a symbol, a target, a trigger. And behind the digital daggers, someone wanted war. Every calculated breath she took trembled beneath layers of instinct she could no longer suppress. Biochemical oscillations surged with violent elegance through her synaptic corridors, a rhythm both foreign and ancient. Her voice, when it finally emerged, came not as command or counsel, but as fracture. She spoke of Velari biology not listed in scientific exchanges, not archived in interspecies briefings. There was a cycle, primal, ritualistic, dangerous, a hormonal cascade misaligned with logic, indifferent to reason. It was called the rut, and it was not meant to be endured alone. Without bond completion, without chosen anchorage, it risked carving new neural patterns, permanently rewiring identity and purpose. Some called it a genetic relic, others an evolutionary punishment. But in every case, it ended the same. The self eroded, devoured by compulsion that would not abate. Those, caught mid-cycle and left unbound, became ghosts behind their own eyes. Brilliant minds dimmed, precision turned to paranoia. Memory, purpose, will, corrupted into fixation. She admitted this not as warning nor plea, but confession. She did not want to be his. The thought of surrendering autonomy to another being, especially a human, was unbearable. Yet the chemistry, surging through her blood, betrayed her. It whispered of proximity, of resonance, of need. What terrified her wasn't desire. It was dissolution. The woman who stood in front of him, measured, sharp, sovereign, might vanish, replaced not by a lover but by a reflection of whatever he was. And that, more than shame, more than scandal, was the abyss she stared into. She didn't want to belong to him. She wanted to survive him, but her pulse had already chosen its trajectory, and time was running out. It began as a data retrieval protocol, just routine, just backup systems. But the archive was older than the central. Lexicon had logged. Carbon-layered partitions, forgotten by design, preserved not algorithms but memory. Not a list of protocols, but a song of flesh. They found records carved not in text but in pheromone sequences and resonance maps, empathic imprints so primal they bypassed language altogether. Velari ancestors had once known communication, not as signal, but as synthesis. Entire generations had synchronized emotional bandwidths through ritual, through willing, deliberate entanglement of sensation and identity. It hadn't been chemical seduction. It had been communion. The ancestors had not evolved past emotion. They had encrypted it, hidden it beneath layers of sterilized cognition and neural suppression, buried it in protocols and shame. Over millennia, their scientists reclassified intimacy as inefficiency, partnership as entropy. Emotional resonance became a malfunction, compassion, a threat vector. But in these echoes, the truth pulsed still. Velari biology had not been rewritten. It had been silenced. The neural signatures that surged between Thy'shira and Corin weren't aberrant. They were echoes, rituals awakening in the marrow of two civilizations that had long forgotten how to listen. This was not corruption, it was recall, and buried deep in those unspoken frequencies was a pattern, interlocking signals, one half Velari, the other unmistakably human. Resonance that neither species had designed but both had once known. Flesh and instinct, reaching across epochs, not for dominance, but for recognition. Emotion was not weakness, it was inheritance, and it was waking up. There were two paths, not choices. No, choices implied freedom. This was biology. This was code rewritten in blood and breath, reaching backward through time and upward through evolution. And for Thy'shira, whose life had been a symphony of precision, the chaos of it threatened to unmake her completely. Her species had protocols, fail-safes, warnings etched into their genome like scars. Do not bond outside the resonance. Do not attempt sacred rites with the uncalibrated. Do not trespass across the boundary of species. That way lay madness. And worse, memory. But protocol meant nothing now. Her mind, once fortress-like, had become porous. Thoughts leaked into sensation. Logic dissolved into longing. Her control was not failing, it was being redefined. She had spent her life believing that evolution had saved them from instinct. Now she saw the lie. It had only hidden it behind laws. To complete the bond was to seal a sacred act of entanglement, once holy, now heretical. Velari, who mated with off-species partners, didn't just face social exile. They ceased being Velari. Their resonance signatures were classified as corrupted. To initiate the ritual with a human wasn't just taboo, it was biological treason, and yet the alternative was worse, manual severance, a surgical interruption of the resonance cascade. It would silence the signal, but not the echo. Her emotional architecture, already destabilized, would collapse inward. Neurological scarring, autonomic failures, a cognitive void where once stood curiosity, drive, memory, a living erasure. Corin knew none of this in full, but he saw her tremble when her tail coiled tight in restraint. He heard the drop in her vocal frequency, tasted the metallic scent of stress bleeding through her pores. He didn't need the science. He saw the soul. He offered nothing at first, no touch, no words, just presence. That in itself was blasphemy made real, because it calmed her, stabilized her vitals, strengthened the bond. This wasn't just a decision between union or exile. It was the collapse of an ideology, the death of a dogma dressed in clinical robes. She had spent years believing the bond was dangerous. Now she feared the absence of it more. To complete it would mean never returning to who she was, but not completing it meant she might never be anything again. The stars offered no refuge. They only echoed back decisions forged in bureaucratic silence and ancestral fear. Earth Command's transmission arrived encrypted but clear. Corin was to be extracted immediately. No negotiation, no appeal. The incident had grown beyond cultural misunderstanding or diplomatic misstep. It was now a matter of planetary risk management. One human, one Velari, one anomaly that neither side could explain or contain. The Velari. High Council responded with the only solution their laws permitted: exile. They did not demand punishment. They demanded distance. For Corin to remain meant potential genetic contamination, ideological corrosion, or worse, an interspecies precedent. The ancient protocols were not suggestions. They were containment, strategies written in the aftermath of forgotten wars. Corin was offered two doors. The first led home to safety, to protocol. But the bond would break, not fade, break. And with it, Thy'shira's stability. Her body might survive. Her mind would not. The second door was darker. He could stay. Not as a human diplomat, but as a destabilizing force. His presence would fracture trust across every quadrant. Treaties would erode. Alliances would falter. And somewhere, buried in political fallout, two beings who never meant to defy anyone would carry the weight of worlds they never meant to divide. There was no sterile resolution, no clean protocol to solve what the heart complicated. It wasn't a choice between staying or leaving. It was a question of which ruin he could live with, and which ruin she could survive. She did not flinch when she volunteered, not when they listed the risks, not when they asked her to reconsider, not when they recited the sterile language of procedure meant to make irreversible decisions sound clinical and clean. She agreed to suppression. The term sounded so benign, so civilized. But the reality was anything but. Her hormonal surge had been deemed a threat, a deviation. And in the eyes of her kind, deviations were treated like viruses. Contain, cauterize, forget. The process they proposed would not just quiet the flood. In her blood, it would sterilize her connection to what made her Velari. Her pheromone pathways would be silenced, her neural pairing capacity severed, the ancient instinct to bond, to resonate, to remember, gone forever. They told her she would retain functionality, that she could still serve, still walk among the high spire and whisper codes of diplomacy, but she would be hollow, a diplomat with no fire, no flame, no future. She spoke of it with measured grace, her voice controlled. She described it as duty, framed it as logic, but her hands betrayed her, trembling, not with fear, but something deeper, something more primal, grief without sound. Corin watched, not as a scientist, not as an envoy, but as a witness to a sacrifice. No species had the right to demand. This wasn't healing, this was quiet annihilation, and it was about to be signed into law by her own trembling fingers. He had spent his career compartmentalizing, obeying directives, respecting boundaries. The first law of xenodiplomacy: observe, do not alter. Biology was sacrosanct, emotion a liability, especially between species, but that law hadn't accounted for this. For her, Thy'shira stood alone in the sterile silence of pending extinction, and they all expected him to stay still, to let her choose erasure because protocol demanded purity. But Corin saw something they didn't, because he wasn't Velari, because he hadn't been taught to fear fire. He saw a mind trying to remain rational while a body begged to survive. He saw a culture that revered control so devoutly it had forgotten the price of silencing instinct. And he saw her hand, trembling in a way no data report could quantify. They called his reaction emotional interference. They warned him that Earth's credibility would collapse if he acted. They said touching her in that moment would be the final nail in diplomatic suicide. But he reached for her anyway, because this wasn't about diplomacy anymore. Not to him. Not when she stood on the edge of vanishing and no one else dared look her in the eyes. He reached because someone had to. Someone had to tell the stars that even among empires and encryption, there still existed one ancient law older than any treaty. You do not let the one you care for walk into annihilation alone. There were no incantations, no banners of state or sigils of approval, no council of scholars, no ceremonial drone to oversee the rite. What transpired between them defied everything inscribed in the Velari codices, everything sanctified by generations of sterile obedience. But it was no less real for the lack of witnesses. In truth, it was more real because of it. He stood before her with no armor of protocol, no veil of scientific detachment. His breath matched hers, not out of design, but because his body knew it had to listen. Her pheromones thickened the air, not as a weapon, not as a seduction, but as truth. A truth her species had hidden for cycles behind cold doctrine and neurochemical inhibitors. She trembled, but not with fear. With vulnerability. Her instincts had been walled off so long she didn't know how to offer them gently, but he didn't flinch. He simply remained. She touched his skin with hers, just a fingertip at first, as if contact might collapse her. Then her tail, coiling around his wrist with a slow certainty born of instinct rediscovered. It wasn't dominance, it wasn't submission, it was declaration. And he responded not with dominance either, but acceptance. No surge of conquest, no human bravado, just presence, stillness, heart open, breath even, his fingers curled against hers, not claiming, only anchoring. In that moment they didn't follow instinct, they forged past it. This was not about mating, it wasn't even about survival anymore. It was about choice, the kind denied to both. Of them by species, too afraid of what might grow from ungoverned connection. The sync wasn't immediate. Their rhythms clashed, staggered, realigned. Pain whispered between the pulses, but the bond didn't shatter. It adapted. They adapted. The data logs would never capture this. The biosensors would misinterpret it as biochemical anomaly, but their bodies understood. Their memories understood. Their bones remembered what the laws had tried to erase. They had not mated, they had met. Not predator and prey, not envoy and envoy. Two souls, neither owned, neither erased, standing inside. The impossible space between species, between instinct and will. And from that space something ancient stirred. Not the old bond, a new one. One not built on biology, but on choice. There should have been screaming. Sirens. The shriek of cultural collapse, or the brittle shatter of neural dissonance. But the universe chose something else, something forgotten. The bond between them did not implode. It did not consume. It resonated. It began in silence, a single pulse beneath the skin, warm, electric, unforced. Then another. A rhythm born not of instinct, but of understanding. From their bodies, bioluminescence flickered in delicate spirals, no longer confined to one or the other, but shared, a resonance too complex for instrumentation, too ancient for linguistic dissection. It moved like breath through crystal, like song through water. The pulse traveled outward. Neural glands across the chamber vibrated in harmonic reply. Velari scientists froze mid-analysis, pupils dilating as an involuntary recognition swept through them. Not arousal, not fear. Something older, something bone deep. A memory without context, encoded in flesh. They remembered, without knowing how or why, that this was not alien. It was ancestral. Biological records had no notation for it. Cultural historians had redacted the rituals. Code weavers had stripped emotion from protocol long before these watchers were born. But their cells remembered. Their glands remembered. Their breath hitched with awe. The pulse did not escalate. It held, contained, alive, undemanding. And that was what shattered them. Not power, but restraint. Not command, but invitation. The silence that followed wasn't fear. It was reverence. Velari, who had advocated for exile, stood without words. Those who had warned of contamination found themselves blinking tears they could not explain. No one moved to intervene. No alarms were triggered. They had seen what the codices had failed to imagine. Human had touched the deepest ritual of their kind and had not twisted it. He had not tried to own it. He had simply been with it. The resonance faded, but the echo remained. Not in pheromones, not in code, but in the stillness that followed. In The knowledge that their past had not been erased by evolution, only buried, and the ones who unearthed it were not Velari. They were the outsiders. The unpredictable, the fragile, the loud, the human. What burned was not a scandal but a signal, the signal that maybe, just maybe, they had not been evolving away from something, but toward it. The change begins not with sirens, but with a tremble in the network, a low irregular hum slipping through the Velari hive mind like a heartbeat out of sync. At first it is mistaken for a glitch, perhaps a resonance echo from the bonding anomaly. But then it spreads. Kin line after kin line begins to stutter in transmission. Emotional harmonics, normally smooth and regulated, fracture into something raw and dissonant. Scientists abandon their lab notes mid-sentence, pupils blown wide as they stare into walls that have never looked so unfamiliar. The data feeds remain active, but comprehension evaporates, replaced by an ache behind the eyes and something older clawing at the base of their skulls. Younglings, too immature to mask their instincts, begin humming. Not in fear, not in mimicry, but in recognition. Ancient tonal vibrations pour from their throats, half song and half cry, passed from one to the next like a torch in the dark. Their voices are untrained, imperfect, but true. A high-caste elder collapses to her knees in the center of the knowledge dome, racked not by pain, but by a sudden, unbearable flood of feeling. No one speaks. They don't need to. The network is flooded with shared sensations, grief, longing, and awe, each surging through collective memory like blood returning to a numb limb. There is no command, no protocol, no hierarchy to catch what is unraveling. The resonance that began with two bodies is now a frequency that bypasses language entirely. It speaks to the Velari not through data, but through inheritance, the kind written in synaptic trails and dormant glands. What began as a scandal now pulses like a signal. Not a cry for rebellion, but a call to remember. They had not evolved away from connection. They had buried it beneath structure, beneath control, beneath fear, and now it rose, not as fire, but as vibration. Across the stars, from outposts to city cores, Velari begin to weep, to sing, to collapse, to hold each other without shame. The hive mind trembles under its own awakening. This is not insurrection. This is recursion. The past had not been lost. It had only waited for someone reckless enough to feel it again. Not Velari. Human. The echo did not fade. It pulsed. Across the quiet chambers of the Velari kin halls, where memory was once sterile and curated, youth began to hum. Not in defiance, but in mimicry, an instinctive compulsion to recreate what their glands remembered and their minds had been taught to forget. The resonance moved faster than light could trace. No comm channels. No transmissions, just sensation, just longing. In the sanctified vaults of data sanctuaries, apprentices stopped reciting protocols. Instead, they placed their palms against crystalline conduits and waited, not for instruction, but for feeling, for that pulse that promised something deeper than classification. And it came, not in a roar, but in synchrony, a frequency of awakening. The key elders reacted swiftly. Emergency codes were activated, archives sealed, neural inhibitors distributed like sacred relics. They spoke of containment, of security, of preserving Velari essence. But behind every decree was fear, not of destruction, but of change. Because what echoed now through the youth was not war. It was identity, not taught, remembered. Generational lines hardened, one side rooted in codices and heritage, the other drawn forward by something older than law, something cellular. It wasn't rebellion, not yet. No banners flew. No weapons gleamed, but eyes were opening. Hearts once cold and calculated stirred with rhythm. The resonance had become a whisper in every spine, a song that bypassed thought, an inheritance that chose to be felt, and the hive, once unified, began to tremble in two directions, forward and back. They were not marched out in chains, nor were they celebrated with banners. Their departure was procedural, bloodless, shrouded in the sterile hush of diplomatic protocol. But in that silence, the truth rang louder than any decree. Corin and Thy'shira became an absence no doctrine could explain. No charges were filed, no punishments declared. Yet the outpost logged them under classified departure. Files locked, names encrypted. Velari systems purged any mention from public archives, as if their existence had become an infection, something contagious, something cultural. But the infection had already spread. On Earth, Corin's name lit up academic networks and activist circles alike. Scholars debated ethics, power, love. Children whispered of aliens who could feel and humans who didn't flinch. On Velari fringe channels, Thy'shira's image appeared in fragmented bursts. Her silhouette, her gaze, her coiled tail looped gently around a human wrist. Always censored, always reposted. Every deletion sparked 3 more echoes. They were not criminals, not heroes. They were worse. They were proof. Proof that instinct could be rewritten, that bonds could be chosen, that a myth was not always born from ancient past, but sometimes from trembling present. The high castes condemned them through silence, but silence breeds mystery, and mystery breeds stories. Some called them cursed, others called them holy, but every child who hummed a forbidden resonance, every elder who paused before enforcing old law, did so with a name on their lips, not forgotten, exiled, and never alone. It wasn't a warship. It wasn't even a research craft by standard definition. It was a relic, diplomatic, outdated, left to rust in orbit before they found it and made it theirs. Refitted with hybrid systems, Velari neural interfaces fused with human intuition-driven controls, it didn't fly by orders. It flew by will. They called it liminal arc. Neither of Earth nor Velari space, neither of what was nor what would be, a threshold given form. Inside it, data logs shared space with scent archives. Emotional spectra were mapped like terrain. Touch and pheromonal response became mission parameters. They weren't authorized, they weren't sanctioned, but they were needed. Their goal wasn't contact, it was comprehension. They drifted through border worlds and neutral zones, seeking not territory but thresholds, where language bent, where instincts failed, where something new flickered between the old codes. Others followed. Not under flags but under questions. Could sentience evolve again, not through war but through wonder? The liminal arc bore no insignia. Its hull bore scars. Its crew bore burdens, but its path was clear. Not peacekeepers, not rebels. Explorers of the one thing neither species had dared to chart, the raw, dangerous potential of meaning shared. The void between stars held nothing but silence, until it didn't. Months into the drift, when routine dulled thought and maps turned into memory, the message came. Not a hail, not a threat, a pulse. Layered frequencies nested within one another like heartbeat over heartbeat, biological, deliberate, undeniable. The ship's systems struggled to decode it. No known syntax, no Velari markers, no human encryption. But the signal wasn't for systems. It was for senses. Thy'shira felt it before the monitors caught it, a harmonic vibration across the glandular core, resonance that didn't belong to her lineage. Corin heard it in the timbre of nothing, a frequency felt behind the eyes. It bypassed comprehension and burrowed into instinct. Then came the line, barely. Translated but crystal clear in its certainty. We felt your pulse, we are coming. Not an invitation, a recognition. Across every module of the liminal arc, the temperature dropped. Not from fear, from awe, because in that moment, the silence of space fractured, and what poured in wasn't just contact, it was consequence. They had reached beyond war, beyond taboo. And someone, something out there had heard the echo and answered. The message played again, not as warning but as witness. Thy'shira watched it, not with fear, but with a trembling kind of reverence, like a child remembering the shape of fire. Corin said nothing. He didn't need to. His thoughts drifted to Earth's most ancient myths, the apple bitten without consent, fire stolen from the gods, a sealed box cracked open by curiosity. None of them asked permission. Yet all of them shaped everything. They were not soldiers now, not scientists, not even lovers. They were something worse. Symbols. And symbols never need permission to change the world. They just do. Gold and violet spilled across the sky like slow-moving fire, twin suns tracing opposite arcs on the horizon. The ship drifted. In planetary orbit, silent but not still. Inside, two figures sat in stillness, not as ambassadors, not as symbols, not even as survivors, just as themselves. There were no translations anymore, no cultural footnotes, no urge to explain away instinct or redefine emotion into something palatable for alien minds. She breathed without control. He felt without apology. The ache between them had faded, not into numbness but into peace. Their silence did not beg to be broken. It had weight, depth, history. It was the silence of things understood without words, like gravity or mourning or love. And beneath those alien suns, in the vast quiet of what came after revolution, they watched a galaxy spin itself new again, not as outsiders, not even as rebels, but as the ones who stayed. They were once defined by roles, by orders, by caste, by mission logs and planetary allegiance. He was sent to observe, she was bred to enforce. But those words unraveled one by one, the moment. They stopped obeying them. There is no word in either tongue for what they became, not lovers, not rebels, not kin. Only a bridge made of contradiction and defiance, stitched together with moments too raw to catalogue and too quiet to report. Others begin to whisper now, not in derision, but in curiosity. Something old and wild has shifted. They were supposed to be anomalies. Instead, they became precedent. The liminal arc shuddered with something deeper than vibration, something older than language. The ship's bioarray pulsed to life, not in alarm but recognition. Across the fibered walls and living dodes, a resonance formed, not Velari, not human, yet familiar in the marrow. It mimicked the bond pulse, Thy'shira's breath, Corin's heartbeat, but refracted, as if filtered through 1,000 civilizations. No syntax, no voice, just a spiraling fractal, encoded in rhythm and light. When rendered, it became a map, not to a place but to a threshold. They stared not in fear but in understanding. This wasn't a message. It was a memory, one deliberately planted. A seed of something once vast, perhaps extinct, perhaps waiting. A species that had once crossed the same boundary of self, of meaning, of what it meant to be. And now it was their turn to answer. Not as emissaries, not as survivors, as inheritors. It hadn't been a message hurled into the void. It had been a lock, ancient and dormant, waiting not for contact but connection. Their union wasn't noise. It was the final key in a circuit laid long before either species learned to speak. Now, across dead systems and buried archives, coordinates blaze to life, cold machines flicker with sudden warmth, forgotten empires echo with harmonics not heard in 1,000 collapses. Across time's dust, something wakes. It doesn't roar. It listens, and in that listening the universe tilts, subtle, seismic, inevitable, because now it knows someone answered.